What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
Mom handed me a cup of tea and said, "I'm sorry for missing your birthday." I took it from her hands and smiled, even though my teeth were clenched tight enough to feel the tension in my jaw. I carried the cup over to the kitchen table, where my sister, Claire, was already seated, scrolling through her phone like she owned the day, like my birthday was just another background noise she didn't need to notice. I poured my own tea into her cup while she wasn't looking and placed hers in front of me. 2 sips later, she started coughing violently, her hands flailing, and Mom froze, staring at her daughter with wide eyes that screamed disbelief. I just sipped my water and waited, my stomach twisting with a satisfaction I wouldn't apologize for, because years of being ignored and brushed aside had built up to this precise moment. The truth is, this wasn't just about a cup of tea. It never had been. It was about a pattern that had stretched for decades, a pattern that I had ignored for far too long because I wanted to believe Mom was fair, that she loved me the same way she loved Claire. Every birthday, every graduation, every minor accomplishment had been a chance for Claire to take center stage while I faded into the background, my presence barely acknowledged unless it was convenient or made her look good. That day, though, I realized it wasn't about proving myself to her or even to Mom. It was about finally reclaiming a little power in a world where they had made me feel powerless for far too long. As Claire coughed and sputtered, the way she looked at me was a mix of panic and betrayal. She didn't understand how it happened or why I didn't just hand it back to her. Mom's hands were shaking, her face turning pale, and for a second I felt almost guilty, but only for a moment. This wasn't cruelty. It was justice in a form that spoke louder than any argument or lecture could. Mom opened her mouth, probably trying to explain or apologize, but no words could reverse the years of favoritism and neglect. I sat there, my tea untouched, savoring the tension I had orchestrated with precision, letting them feel the weight of the imbalance they had always ignored. I thought back to other birthdays, ones that were celebrated quietly because Claire's needs always came first. I remembered the party when I had turned 15 and asked for a modest cake, only to watch Mom buy Claire a dress that had cost more than my entire party. I remembered the Christmases where Claire's gifts were extravagant, perfectly wrapped, while mine were late or clearly afterthoughts. I remembered the moments when I tried to speak up, tried to assert that my feelings mattered too, and was met with sighs, rolled eyes, or statements like, "You'll understand when you have kids of your own." Every one of those moments had chipped away at me, leaving a hollow space where love should have been, and that hollow space had finally hardened into a kind of strategic patience, waiting for the right moment to tip the scales. Claire finally recovered, coughing less violently but still wide-eyed and shaking, her hands clutching the cup that had betrayed her. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch, letting Mom's stunned expression do all the talking. It wasn't about tea, it was about control, and in that kitchen, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I had it. I had thought through every step of what I was doing, every possible reaction from both of them, and it all played out exactly as I had imagined. There was no chaos, no unnecessary harm, just a moment that perfectly highlighted the imbalance they had ignored for years. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration, asking if I had meant for this to happen, if I had planned it, and I smiled again, letting the answer hang unspoken between us. This was just the beginning, the first domino in a line that would stretch further than either of them could anticipate. Claire's glare was sharp, filled with a confusion and anger that only comes when someone realizes they have underestimated the person they thought was harmless. Mom's face shifted from shock to anger to a tentative calculation, and I could see her starting to realize that I wasn't the quiet, compliant daughter she had always assumed I was. I could see the fear of losing control in her eyes, and it felt like a quiet victory that no one could argue with, a satisfaction that was mine alone. It wasn't about hurting Claire or proving a point to Mom. It was about demonstrating that I had boundaries, that I had a voice, and that I had the ability to act when I had been dismissed for too long. I sipped my water again, casually, letting the moment sink in. I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The room was heavy with recognition, with the realization that the rules had changed, even if only temporarily. The rest of the day was quiet, almost painfully normal, but the shift had occurred. Mom stayed close to me, careful with every word, every gesture, as though she had just learned something about the daughter she thought she knew. Claire avoided my eyes for the rest of the afternoon, still coughing occasionally, still unsure of how to navigate the sudden imbalance. By the time dinner was over, I had already started thinking about what came next. I wasn't finished. The tea swap was only the first move in a game that had been decades in the making, and I intended to play it all the way through. Mom's favoritism had created cracks that I was going to explore, carefully and deliberately. Claire's arrogance had made her predictable, and her predictability was my advantage. I had spent years learning how to navigate a family that seemed determined to ignore me, and now I had the upper hand, even if they didn't realize it yet. That night, I went to bed with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years, knowing that for the first time, I had acted in a way that truly represented me. I had spoken without words, taken control without confrontation, and set the stage for everything that would follow. They didn't know it yet, but I had started something that they could not undo. I had begun to shift the balance in a family that had always been skewed, and I wasn't about to stop until it was mine. The satisfaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, personal, and completely mine. I had waited for the right moment, and I had seized it. I had made them feel a fraction of what I had felt for years, and that fraction was enough to ignite the fire that would carry me through everything that came next. The morning after the tea, I woke up with that strange mix of calm and adrenaline that sits under your skin when you know you finally stopped accepting the script everyone else wrote for you and started writing your own. And instead of rushing to explain myself or patch the moment with apologies that only teach people you are safe to disrespect, I made coffee, opened my notes app, and began listing the patterns that had been eating at me for years, because I wanted evidence, not feelings, and I wanted to see with my own eyes how often I had smoothed things over, paid for things, rearranged schedules, and let them call it love. I went through our family group chat and scrolled past the familiar waves of praise for Claire and the softer, colder replies for me, and as I replayed weekend plans, canceled dinners, and birthdays that somehow turned into errands for someone else, I realized my resentment was not a single event. It was a ledger with entries going back to childhood, and every entry had a date and a receipt, some of them literal, because when I searched my email I found confirmations for restaurant deposits, gift orders, and a rental van for Claire's engagement party that had been put on my card after Mom assured me she would handle it later, which she never did, and I remembered how often I told myself not to make a big deal out of it, because peace was worth more than money, until I understood that the peace I kept paying for with my silence never included me. I started with clean moves that would feel small to them but felt like oxygen to me, so I logged into a couple of accounts that had been set up under my name back when Mom guilted me about being the only one who understood online forums. And I changed the billing contact on the Lake House utilities to Mom's email and phone number, because if she wanted to be in charge, she could also be the person the power company called at 6 in the morning, and I ended the streaming service I had been carrying for the entire family, not out of spite, but because I was tired of being the quiet infrastructure everybody used without noticing, and when the inevitable text came from Claire asking why the movie stopped during her lunch break, I told her in a long, simple message that the account had been mine and I had decided to keep it personal, which she tried to spin as selfish, but I did not bite. I just kept my tone even and repeated that I was done paying for things that were not mine. Then I did something that felt small and heavy at the same time, because it landed like a knock on a locked door, and I knew they would hear it. I sent Mom a payment request with a clear note that listed the engagement party van, the bakery fee for Claire's gender reveal, the deposit I had put down for the restaurant that canceled my own birthday dinner 2 years ago when everyone forgot to confirm, and the flowers that Mom had asked me to order for her book club and promised to reimburse, and I sent it in the family group chat rather than privately, not to humiliate, but to make the ledger visible, because secrecy is the best friend of favoritism, and once the sunlight hits it, even the people who benefit from it start to feel the heat. Mom tried to pivot into hurt feelings, typing that she wished I had come to her directly, which made me laugh a little, because I had, many times, and those talks had vanished like steam off a pot, so I stayed polite and steady, told her I was happy to talk, and that I would appreciate the transfer by the end of the week, and a funny thing happened right then, because my aunt chimed in with a gentle message about fairness, and my cousin sent a heart, and I felt the weight shift a few inches in my direction, which was not victory, but it was leverage, and I did not waste it. I kept working through the pattern, not with rage but with a method I should have adopted years ago. So I called the salon that had been holding a standing appointment for Claire under my customer profile because I had set it up once as a gift, and it never got changed back, and I asked them to move the profile to Claire's name and card, which they did without drama. And I could almost hear the click of control returning to my side of the line, and when Claire texted a sarcastic thank you, I said you were welcome, because she could not accuse me of anything real, not when all I was doing was putting things where they belonged. That afternoon, I stopped by Mom's place to pick up a box of my old documents, and while she was in the kitchen pretending to be busy, I found a small folder in the hall cabinet with a sticky note that had my name on it. And inside the folder there was not the college bond she swore existed or the birthday savings card she used to brag about to family friends, but an empty sleeve and a photocopy of a beneficiary form naming Claire for something that should have been split. And I did not say a word about it. I just slid the copy into my purse and left the sleeve where I found it, because I wanted to see how long it would take her to realize I knew. By evening, I had my own folder ready with screenshots, receipts, that photocopy, and a short list of questions that even a defensive parent would have trouble dodging, and when Mom called to ask if we could meet on Sunday to talk like adults, I said yes, and told her I would bring a friend for support, which she did not like, although she pretended she did, and I did not clarify that the friend I meant happened to be a financial planner who owed me a favor and was very good at translating guilt into math, because I wanted that discovery to land live at the table, and when I hung up, I looked at the little pile of proof on my couch and felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was control without apology. And I decided that before Sunday arrived, I was going to deliver one more message that could not be ignored, so I opened the group chat again, drafted a calm invitation for a late birthday dinner at a place Claire loved but never paid for, and attached a split request, with the total divided evenly and a due date stamped for the night before we met, and when I hit send and watched the read receipts line up one by one, I knew I had pulled another thread that would not stop unraveling, because this time I was not waiting for permission to be treated fairly, and I was not going to drink anything they poured without checking the label first. The split request sat in the group chat like a quiet alarm that never stopped ringing, and by the time lunchtime rolled around, I had watched Mom type and delete the same half-dozen lines so many times that I could imagine the excuses without needing to read them, while Claire took the faster route and called me, not to talk like a grown woman with a calendar and a bank account, but to perform the familiar routine where she acted confused about logistics and tried to make that confusion my responsibility. And instead of walking her through anything I told her, in a tone I would use with a vendor, that the reservation remained as planned for Saturday, that the deposit would be handled by the contact on file, and that all anyone needed to do was show up, split their portion, and treat me like a person who did not have to prepay for the privilege of being included in her own life. They did show up, of course they did, because Claire loved that restaurant and loved being seen there, and what she did not love was hearing from the host that the deposit had been charged to the name listed on the reservation, which was hers. Because the message confirming the booking had gone to her phone after I put her down as the contact, a choice I made without fanfare and without apology, and when she hissed at me that I had ambushed her, I reminded her, with a smile that did not reach my eyes, that for years I had paid deposits for her events because I was the only one who could figure out the website, so she could consider this a new era of independence, which she did not appreciate. Although to her credit, she kept it together until we were seated. Mom tried to start the meal with a little speech about moving past awkward moments, and she sprinkled in a few soft comments about how families sometimes make mistakes and how intent matters more than execution, and I let her talk. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted her to spend her words before I used mine, and when she finally landed on a line about wanting me to feel celebrated, I said I appreciated that and that I had made it easy for everyone to participate by sending the split request, and then I asked the server for separate checks at the end, which earned me the look that says you have broken an unspoken rule, even though the only rule I have broken is the one that requires me to subsidize the people who call me selfish when I stop. We placed our orders, and while the table pretended to relax, I could see the flinches, the little micro-calculations running through Mom's head about how to steer things back into the lane where she felt powerful, which she did by pivoting to Claire's new project and telling a story that positioned Claire as a selfless hero and me as a supportive footnote, and I did not interrupt. I just waited until she finished and said that I was happy for Claire, that I hoped the project went well, and that I would not be covering any startup costs the way I had done before, because I was done fronting money and pretending it was tradition, and the silence after that sentence landed was the kind you only hear when people realize the old playbook just got burned. I did not raise my voice. I did not drag out the binder I had packed in my tote. I simply told Mom, in the same careful tone she used with me whenever she wanted obedience, that I had scheduled time on Sunday for a sit-down about the ledger, and that a friend would join us to keep the conversation focused on facts rather than feelings, and when she asked what kind of friend I meant, I said the kind who knows how to add, which was me being petty. Yes, but also me refusing to romanticize a pattern. That had cost me actual dollars and actual pride, and I could see in the way she held her fork that the message had landed. The checks arrived, and for the first time in a long time there was no awkward slide of paper toward me as if I were the designated fixer, no assumption that I would pull out my card and save them from embarrassment, because I let the server place each bill in front of the right person, and I paid mine without flinching. And just before we stood up, I sent a message to the group chat with a clean summary of the outstanding reimbursements and a polite note that I had placed a freeze with the credit bureaus on all new accounts tied to my information, which meant that any service still connected to my name would stop at the door until it was corrected, and I added that I had already switched the utilities on the lake house and the salon profile, so they should expect calls and emails that needed their attention instead of mine. Claire started to protest that this was dramatic and unnecessary, that family does not nickel and dime each other, and I told her that I agreed with the spirit of that statement, that family should not nickel and dime, which is why the nickel and diming needed to stop, which is why I had stopped it, and when she asked if the tea had been some kind of warning, I took a sip of my water and said I was done explaining symbolism in a kitchen where nothing I said ever counted as real, and I let that sentence hang there until Mom finally whispered that Sunday would be fine and that I did not need to bring anyone, and I told her I would bring him anyway, because support is not a threat when you have nothing to hide. We pushed our chairs back. Claire muttered that she would send her part when she got home. Mom said she would check some old files before we met, and I walked out of the restaurant feeling that thin, electric steadiness you get when the line you drew holds. And as the door closed behind us, my phone buzzed with a new notification that made me smile without moving a muscle, because the deposit for the dinner had just been marked settled on Claire's card, and the reimbursement request showed Mom had paid one of the older items in full, and I knew we were finally moving, not because they wanted to make things right out of love, but because the cost of ignoring me had started to feel like more work than respecting me, and I was not about to let them forget that lesson before Sunday. Sunday arrived with the kind of steady focus that comes when you have done your homework and packed your binder and rehearsed the calm tone you are going to use no matter how many times someone tries to turn math into a guilt trip. So I drove to Mom's place with Maya in the passenger seat, and while Mom opened the door with that brittle smile that says she wants to reset the day without acknowledging what happened yesterday, I introduced Maya as my friend who would help keep the conversation organized, because I was tired of leaving important talks with nothing but a headache and an apology I did not owe. And when Claire drifted in late with a drink and a shrug, I simply set the binder on the table and said that I had printed the ledger so no one would have to guess. I started at the beginning and walked through each entry without heat, because the point was not to humiliate anyone. The point was to put a border around something that had spread across years and bank statements and ruined dinners. So I read the line for the engagement van and the bakery fee and the restaurant deposit and the salon profile, and with every receipt Maya slid the matching screenshot forward like a simple proof that did not need a story attached, and when Mom said she did not remember things exactly that way, Maya nodded, said that memory can be slippery, and tapped the dates and amounts and the confirmation numbers that do not forget. And for the first time in a long time, I watched Mom look down at facts that would not move just because she wanted them to, which was not victory. Not yet, but it was ground that did not tilt under my feet. I did not stop there, because I had promised myself I would not let this turn into another fog of feelings, so I pulled the photocopy of the beneficiary form from the folder. The one with my name on the sticky note and Claire listed as the only recipient of something Mom had always described as a shared promise, and I asked the simplest question I could form, which was whether she had ever intended to tell me that the promise had been rewritten without me, and when she tried to say it was complicated, I told her I respected complicated, that I live in complicated every day, but that complicated still has to balance. And that if the grandparents' money had been repurposed, then we were going to put that decision on paper with signatures and witnesses and dates, because I was done being the only adult in the room who carried both the silence and the bill. Mom bristled and tried to frame the tea as a warning shot that had frightened her, which was the first honest sentence she had offered, and I said that the tea had been a demonstration, not of violence, but of control. Because I had finally decided that my safety could not depend on people who only respected boundaries they could see, and that if she felt scared by that moment, then she had finally met the edge of my patience, which she had been leaning on for years without ever asking how much weight it could hold, and the way Claire's eyes flicked to the folder told me she understood that the props on the table were not theater, they were rails that would keep us from driving this conversation into the same ditch as always. Maya, who has a gift for turning mess into steps, proposed a simple repayment schedule with dates that lived on a calendar instead of in the warm fog of someday, and she drafted a short memorandum that did not accuse and did not grandstand. It just listed the items, the totals, the timeline, and a clause that said future shared costs would require advance approval from all parties or they would not exist, and, while she wrote, I added one more line that mattered to me, which was that any account, subscription, or utility connected to my name would be moved to the correct person within a week or it would be shut off, not as a threat, but as a housekeeping rule that should have been obvious. Claire tried to argue that dragging a financial professional into a family chat was overkill, and I said that calling fairness overkill is the reflex of a person who has never had to chase their own money, and I told her that I was not ashamed of needing backup. Because backup is what people bring when they are serious about change, and when Mom said that we could handle this privately, I reminded her that privately had been the graveyard where every promise went to die, and that this time I had copied my aunt on a short summary of the ledger and invited her to a follow-up next weekend if the memorandum did not get signed, because sunlight is not cruelty when the choices have been hidden long enough to grow mold. The pen hovered, and for a beat I felt the old panic surge, the part of me that worries about keeping the peace even when the peace has never included me, and I looked at Maya, who said nothing, because she knew I had to carry this last inch alone. So I pulled one more envelope from my bag and slid it across to Claire, explaining that inside were prepaid labels for the items she had borrowed over the years and never returned, including the microphone I had bought for my freelance work and the tablet that somehow ended up at the lake house, and that she could either drop them back to me this week or pay their listed value in full, because I am not a storage unit and the era of casual taking had ended. And when she opened the envelope and saw the inventory list with photos and prices, her mouth tightened, but she did not toss it aside. She placed it next to the memorandum and said she would look through her place tonight. Mom finally signed, but her hand shook enough to tell me the signature felt like a surrender she intended to challenge later, and I kept my voice even as I thanked her, because I did not need triumph to sound like gloating. I needed it to feel like a lock clicking shut. And as I stood to leave, I mentioned that I had scheduled a call with the insurance agent for Tuesday, with both daughters invited, to clarify the status of the policy and the origin of the funds, not because I wanted a fight, But because clarity is not a cruelty, and I watched the color drain from Mom's face in a way that told me this was the pressure point she had hoped I would never touch. On the drive home, Maya leaned back and said the plan was clean and the paper trail was tight, and the next step would either be a quiet transfer that closed the ledger or a louder meeting where the people who used to praise Mom's prudence would learn how it had been financed. And I realized with a steadiness that surprised me that I did not fear either outcome, because the revenge today was not a performance or a sting, it was the installation of a system that made favoritism expensive and silence impossible. And as my phone chimed with the first scheduled transfer notice from Mom's bank, I knew the next move would be mine, and I already knew where to play it. The insurance call did not start as a showdown. It started like any other customer appointment where a polite professional confirmed names and dates and read a script about verification. Yet within a few minutes the tone shifted because the agent pulled up the original notes that referenced my grandparents' letter of intent, the one that said their gift was meant for both daughters in equal measure. And when the agent said that any later changes that cut out one beneficiary would require documentation that did not appear on the file, I let the silence stretch long enough for Mom to understand that this was not a matter of memory or preference. It was a matter of a paper trail that led back to a promise she had rewritten in pencil and hoped no one would ever notice. And before she could pivot to panic, I thanked the agent, asked her to email the required correction forms to all parties, and said we would come by with identification the next day to sign, which is when Mom finally asked whether this meant she had no say, and I told her that she had a choice to make, but that the choice now lived inside rules she did not invent and could not bend, and the way her shoulders sank told me she finally recognized that the tea had not been a threat. It had been a thesis. I did not turn the call into a spectacle. I did not announce a lawsuit. I simply forwarded the agent's email to Mom, to Claire, and to my aunt with a line that thanked everyone for handling the correction promptly. Because I had learned that the most effective form of pressure is often the calm expectation that something will be done the right way on time, and the way people scramble to avoid looking sloppy does the rest. So when Mom texted me privately to ask whether we could keep the family out of this, I replied that the family had been brought in the moment the promise was changed, and that sunlight now was not punishment, it was prevention, and I ended the message with a thank you rather than a threat, because I wanted the record to show that I had tried the dignity route first. The next day we sat in the agent's office, and with my aunt present and Maya on a quiet call for backup, the forms were placed in front of us with lines for signatures and dates, and the agent explained in a clear voice that the beneficiaries would be restored to equal status, and that any future attempt to alter that balance would trigger a review and a hold. And when Mom signed with a hand that trembled the way it had trembled over the memorandum at her kitchen table, I felt the click of a lock sliding into place inside my ribs, not because money solves love, but because power without receipts had been the condition of my life for too long, and now the receipts existed and the power had to live inside them. I did not stop there, because revenge that ends in paperwork feels clean but not complete. So I asked the agent to witness a short statement I had prepared in simple language that said the earlier beneficiary change had been a mistake and that equity was the intention going forward. And when the agent stamped it and slid copies into 3 folders, I handed one to Mom, one to Claire, and kept one for myself, knowing that when the inevitable holiday narrative arrived where the past was rewritten into something softer, I would have a page that refused to lie, which was all I ever wanted from any of them. After we left the office, I suggested we stop by a nearby cafe to talk, and while Claire ordered something sweet and tried to pretend we were already past the awkwardness, I opened my bag and placed 2 small items on the table. The first being the receipts ledger with a few new payments marked complete, and the second being the little tea infuser that had started this war, which made Mom flinch, and I told them, in a voice even enough to sound kind, that the swap had never been poison or danger, that it had been a harmless throat soother loaded with Quran, the same mix I brew for myself when I am congested and that I knew Claire hated, and that I had chosen it because I wanted a demonstration of boundaries that did not require yelling or groveling or a speech that would be dismissed, and that the point had never been to hurt. The point had been to make them feel the disruption they had built into every one of my milestones, and to show them that from now on I would decide what entered my cup and what did not. Mom said that sounded theatrical, and I said maybe it was, except that theater is usually pretend and this had been real, and then I told her I had one last step and that she would not like it, which is that I had set up a revocable trust funded by my restored half and anything I collect from the ledger. A trust that named no parent as a controller and included a clause that guaranteed any future help to family would come as grants with terms rather than as silent gifts that turned into expectations, and Claire rolled her eyes and said that sounded cold, and I told her it was the warmest thing I had ever done for myself because it made my yes mean yes and my no mean no, which is the only way relationships stay alive after years of imbalance. I pushed a final envelope across the table, a copy of the signed memorandum and the insurance correction along with a letter I had written in plain language for the family chat, not an expose, just a simple statement that we had squared the books, restored the promise, and agreed on rules, and that while I did not hold grudges, I would be operating with receipts from now on, and that any future celebration I was part of would be planned as a team or I would not attend, and I told them I would send it tonight, which meant this quiet cafe was their last chance to ask for an edit or to offer a real apology that belonged on the record rather than in a whisper. Mom looked at Claire the way she always did when she wanted an ally, and for once Claire did not jump, perhaps because she had absorbed the cost of Saturday's dinner and had read the calendar reminders that now lived in her inbox. And after a long pause, Mom said she was sorry in a way that did not try to spin the word into something else, and while I do not build my life around apologies, I did let that one land, and then I stood up, slipped the tea infuser back into my bag, and told them I was heading out because I had plans that did not include managing anyone's reactions, and as I walked to the door my phone buzzed with 2 notifications. One confirming the beneficiary update as processed and the other confirming the final reimbursement from the old ledger, and I felt that same steady calm from the moment I sipped my water and let the coughing speak for me. Because the final move had not been the tea or the memo or the signatures, it had been the decision to build a system that kept my dignity on autopilot, and that is how I won, not with noise or guilt, but with a plan that made fairness the only path that cost less than disrespect, and if they thought that was too far then they could pay the toll for the scenic route without me.